Chapter 7 of My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 7. It was not very tragic. The first time I saw him and the last time I saw him I laughed, and the interval was not unamusing. Quite suddenly he had become the fashion. Some great lady in London, I forget who, had heard Claude Carson recite one of his own love songs at a concert got up for a charity, and she had invited him to her house, where he had met other women of fashion, and between themselves in their little set they had determined to make him the mode. It was at one of the Duchess of Birmingham's nicest parties, one of her small musical evenings, that we first saw him. I had been away from town a month or two, and was out of touch with London things, so that when someone said excitedly to me in the supper room, "Oh, come upstairs. Claude Carson is going to recite," and I saw all the women trailing out of the room at once, I turned to the nearest young man to ask what it all meant. "Oh, some cad with long hair who rolls his eyes about and recites erotic poems. Meet him at every blessed place you go to," was the answer, as my informant helped himself to plover's eggs and reached for a fresh bottle of champagne. Upstairs, however, in the music room, there was a flutter of excitement. A royal duchess was present, an event, coupled with the fact that this new artist was going to perform, favoring that kind of electric buzz in the air which is so precious to the ears of an anxious hostess. Round the grand piano was a line of pretty women, all with their eyes turned towards the seated figure at the music stool. There was perfect silence as Mr. Claude Carson rippled a few chords over the keys. I peeped over the shoulders of 2 or 3 people in front of me, and saw a white face framed in long blonde hair which fell in one straight lock across the forehead. The eyes, which were fixed on the cornice of the ceiling, were dark gray in color, and full of what young ladies call soul. The nose was thin and straight, the lips full and beautifully curved, the jaw rather square and pathetically thin. It was a face out of a Burne-Jones picture. Then the long white hands moved rhythmically over the piano, and Claude Carson, sweeping an ineffably weary glance along the line of pretty faces bent towards him, finally fixed his gaze on the royal duchess, and began to recite, speaking his words in a rather monotonous tone to an accompaniment of ripples and chords. "Ah, he is going to do that charming thing from his Roses of Passion, the book which he is just going to publish," somebody whispered excitedly. "I like him best when he recites his own poems." First Mr. Claude Carson told us how he had met a young person in the twilight's mellow time, and how the daisies had kissed her feet, but how she, swerving beneath his glances, had flitted through the network fine of buds which blow in hawthorn's glow. But eventually it appeared the lady had not proved so coy, for in the second verse Mr. Carson very justly remarked, "But if you linger in that place, beneath the hawthorn's interlace, and I may gaze upon your face, shall love forego sweet passion's flow? The stars alone look down on high, the winds alone repeat your sigh. No eyes our lonely tryst descry, they little know, they little know." Fans waved in time to the quaint rhythm, necks were craned forward, eyes drooped and glistened, there were pensive smiles on curved lips. It was not very good, but there was something magnetic about the strange performance. Claude Carson effectually filled the stage. While he was reciting, it was impossible to look in any other direction. "And if the second twilight break, faint bird notes sweet the morning make, and wondering world now reawake, and life reflow with love and woe. The new day finds us parted, sweet, and new worlds open at our feet. Once strange, as strangers shall we meet. We little know, we little know." He finished in a whisper which just filtered through his clenched teeth. An elderly gentleman coughed severely, and a couple of young ones, with faces as unemotional as their glistening shirt fronts, exchanged a swift, expressive glance. The royal duchess beamed approval, and signified that the reciter should be presented to her. The whole performance was a delightful interlude in the decorous solemnity of her exalted existence. I was the only woman in the room who laughed. "I suppose it's an acquired taste, like caviar or absinthe," I said to a smart woman near me, "but one has got to get accustomed to it. Why does he play the piano all the time if he's going to recite?" The smart lady surveyed me with a withering glance. "It's the most charming thing in London," she said. "Claude Carson is a delightful person." All heads were turned in the direction of the young poet as he stood talking to the royal duchess, his beautiful eyes fixed on her face, while occasionally, with a pretty, fatigued movement, he raised a white, graceful hand and pushed back the lock of blonde hair from his forehead. Before the short conversation was over she had invited him to come and see her. "It's stupid, hardly decent, and almost incomprehensible," said Christina as we drove home, "so I shouldn't wonder if he became the rage this season." And sure enough he did. One found him everywhere one went, and I had grown quite accustomed to the thrilling tones of his languorous voice, the enigmatic look in his deep-set eyes, when one night he asked to be introduced to me. "Everywhere," said Mr. Carson as he dropped into a chair at my side. "Everywhere I see your face. But until to night I did not know who you were," he added softly. His tone, his manner annoyed me. "Perhaps you didn't ask," I suggested, though an instant later I was sorry that I should have allowed myself to be flippant with a strange young man of whom I did not altogether approve. And then he did something which showed that he was clever. He gazed at me in perfect silence for several minutes, until the memory of my flippant words had quite died away. "Come," he said at last in his thrilling tones, "let me give you some strawberries." I took his arm and went. We had a charming time that night. Claude Carson was less absurd than he looked. Under his little affectations there was a boyish, frank personality which was really attractive, and when he could forget the fact that all the women in the room were staring at him, and remember that he was not expected to keep up the character of a modern Minnesänger while he helped you to quails and plovers' eggs, he was a nice, simple boy. Afterwards, by the by, I heard that he was at least 28. But he was one of those fair, clean-shaven individuals who never look as if they had emerged from their teens. "I want to come and see you," said Claude Carson that night, holding my hand as we stood under the portico waiting for the carriage. "When may I come?" "We are at home on Sundays at 5. "Not then, not in a crowd of people," he pleaded. "I want to see you alone." "Oh, in that case," I answered, laughing, "don't come on a Sunday. Come, say on Wednesday, and then you will see Christina." But Christina, when he finally appeared, found him impossible. She said that his hands were too white, and that the shape of his collar was revolting. She did not like his poems. Generally she did not understand what they meant, and when she did, she said she wished she hadn't. Claude Carson began to come a good deal. He was always dropping in at tea time, and he never failed to look reproachful if he found me pouring out tea for Mr. Mandel, Val Redmond, or Tony Lambert. He would sit in a low chair, leaning back, and regarding me with half-closed eyes, a habit which Christina declared was insufferable. Indeed, she generally remembered she had letters to write when Mr. Carson called. "I have come to offer you what I prize most in the world," he said one day when we were alone. "But I never take things, anything but flowers. I mean, from people," I objected hastily. "Ah, but you will. You must accept this. I dedicate to you my roses of passion, the first born of my brain. Dear child, they are yours." He handed me a bit of paper on which was written, "To M.W. These, my first trembling chords on the instrument of life, I dedicate to you. Perfect soul, framed in your strange, subtly sweet beauty, I worship you from without, with never a thought of earthly guerdon. Fools only wish to pluck the star from the heavens, the lily from its stem. I leave my star in the blue vault, my lily in its garden. London, February, 189 . "Oh," I said, "how nice! Only you mustn't put 'To M.W.' You had better put 3 stars. I shall know who you mean." We sat and talked for a long time in the twilight. It was the end of February, and the late afternoon was tinged with the pale, wondering light of an early English spring. The trees outside were swelling with purple buds, and through the black branches there was the gleam of a tender, rosy sunset. It was the time of confidences, and the kind of day one says all sorts of things one doesn't mean, in a soft, regretful voice, just because they sound well and seem to fit into the emotional hour. Claude Carson knelt on the window seat, his blonde hair turned to pale gold against the window pane. "You have helped me more than any woman I have ever known," he said at last, with a sigh. "Have I?" I asked, touched, flattered, and pleased. I was at an age when a girl likes to be called a woman. "I'm sure I don't know how. What have I ever done for you?" He gazed at me for a few seconds, and then turned abruptly away. "You have made my life happier," he said. In another instant he had pressed my hand and was gone. Christina's dry tones called me back to mundane things. "And so you have had that impossible young man here for hours," said my sister, bursting into the room with all the matter of fact and common sense which an afternoon out of doors brings with it. "May I ask if you intend to make a fool of him, too?" "To make a fool of him? No. I don't think I shall ever be able to do that." And my words, to be sure, came true. A little while after, we were driving one afternoon towards Hammersmith when suddenly the coachman pulled up. A huge dray had got across the road, and for a few moments we were obliged to wait while a small crowd urged the horses this way and that. We had stopped in a street of small stucco houses, whose weedy front gardens were suggestive of anything but rural delights. And then, as we waited, a thin, undersized child of 7 ran out of one of the open hall doors, a door which revealed a vision of a perambulator, a shabby oilcloth, and a framed oleograph, and hung staring over the green painted rails. "How dare you! Come in directly, Ermyntrude," said a querulous voice, and for an instant I caught a glimpse of a rather good-looking young woman in a cheap tailor-made gown. "I shall tell your father. You are a most disobedient child." A moment later a young man strode down the graveled path, seized the undersized child in his arms, kissed her, and carried her indoors. Just as he disappeared in the doorway our eyes met. The young man was Claude Carson. "So he is married, your modern Minnesänger," said Christina dryly, holding her chin up and looking straight in front of her as we drove on. "Apparently," I said, shrugging my shoulders and gazing at the coachman's back. I was not to be outdone in imperturbability by Christina. "He has married the landlady's daughter. Poets generally do. But it was considerate of him," she continued with a twinkle in the corner of her eye, "to leave his star in the blue vault, his lily in its garden, seeing that he has already got one lily and a promising bud or two in Khartoum Gardens, Hammersmith." And then we both fell back on the cushions and gave way to uncontrollable giggles. I laughed till the tears ran down my cheeks. "When will you learn sense?" sighed Christina. End of chapter 7.